They were told that America was a nation of shopkeepers and film stars, a mongrel country weakened by democracy and luxury, incapable of matching the steel discipline of the Reich. They were told that American soldiers were soft, that American industry was inefficient, that the war would be decided before the sleeping giant could even rise from its couch. But in the forests of France and the rubble of German cities, in prisoner of war camps and on muddy roads choked with traffic, German officers stood in silent bewilderment at a sight their entire ideology had assured them was impossible. Everywhere they looked, there were vehicles, American vehicles, thousands upon thousands of them, stretching to horizons, rumbling past in convoys that seemed to have no end, each one fresh and new and ready, each one a small green testament to a truth that shattered everything they thought they understood about war and will and the ordering of the world. Oberst Heinrich Weber first saw them on a June morning in 1944, 3 weeks after the Normandy invasion. He had been a professional soldier for 20 years, had studied logistics at the War Academy, had overseen supply operations across 2 fronts. He understood the mathematics of warfare, the careful calculations of fuel and ammunition and replacement parts. He knew what was possible. He stood at the edge of a Norman hedgerow with his staff, glasses raised, watching an American convoy move along the coastal road below, and he counted vehicles until the numbers lost meaning. Jeeps and trucks, trucks and jeeps, interspersed with half-tracks and tank transporters and mobile artillery pieces, all moving with casual certainty through what had been, just days before, contested territory. They drove as if they owned the road, as if there would always be more where these came from, as if the very concept of scarcity was something that happened to other armies. "How many do you count?" his adjutant asked, voice tight with something that might have been fear. Weber lowered his glasses. The convoy was still passing. "It doesn't matter," he said. "There will be more tomorrow." The jeeps were what struck him first. Not tanks, not the heavy machinery of war, but these small, almost frivolous-looking vehicles that seemed to be everywhere at once. They carried officers and radios and supplies. They towed small artillery pieces. They mounted machine guns. They served as ambulances and reconnaissance vehicles and mobile command posts. They were standardized, each one identical to the next, painted the same flat olive green, built to the same specifications. This was what his mind struggled to accept. Not that the Americans had vehicles, but that they had so many identical vehicles, that somewhere across an ocean was a factory producing these machines in such quantities that they could be discarded when they broke, abandoned when they bogged down, written off without a second thought, because there would always be another one rumbling up behind. The German army moved on horses. This was a fact that Weber's staff reports carefully obscured, that propaganda glossed over, that the high command discussed only in closed rooms with troubled expressions. The mechanized divisions that had carved through Poland and France were the exception, not the rule. The vast majority of the Wehrmacht depended on hundreds of thousands of horses to pull artillery, carry supplies, move food and ammunition from railheads to fighting positions. These horses needed feed and rest. They fell sick. They died. They could not be manufactured in factories or shipped across oceans in the holds of Liberty ships. And yet here was an entire army that seemed to regard horses as quaint relics, that moved on rubber tires and internal combustion engines, that treated mechanical transport not as a precious resource to be carefully husbanded, but as an expendable commodity available in infinite supply. Weber had read the intelligence reports about American industrial capacity. He had seen the numbers estimating vehicle production, had studied the assessments of their manufacturing base. He had dismissed them, as most of his colleagues had, as exaggerations or perhaps deliberate misinformation. The numbers were simply too large to be credible. No nation could produce trucks and jeeps at such a rate. No economy could sustain that level of output while simultaneously building ships and aircraft and weapons. It violated the logic of resource allocation, the zero-sum calculus that governed all military planning. But here was the evidence, rolling past in an endless stream, and his mind could not reconcile what he was seeing with what he had been taught to believe about the natural order of industrial warfare. That night, In a farmhouse that served as temporary headquarters, Weber sat with his logistics officer going over their own supply situation. They had 17 trucks operational, down from 42 at the start of the month. They had no replacement vehicles. They had spare parts scavenged from vehicles too damaged to repair. They had 36 horses that were slowly starving because feed was needed elsewhere. Their fuel allocation had been cut again. Their men were moving supplies by hand, cart, and bicycle and on their backs, while less than 5 kilometers away, American soldiers rode in vehicles so numerous that Weber had watched them park dozens of jeeps in a field like a farmer storing hay. "It's not possible," the logistics officer said, "not for the first time." He was a practical man, a former engineer, someone who understood production schedules and material requirements. The fuel alone, the maintenance, the rubber for tires, the steel. Where does it all come from? Weber had no answer. None of his training had prepared him for an enemy who could simply overwhelm material constraints through sheer abundance. German doctrine emphasized efficiency, concentration of force, the careful preservation of equipment. American doctrine, it seemed, emphasized having so much equipment that efficiency became irrelevant. The jeeps haunted him. They appeared in his dreams, an endless parade of identical vehicles, each one emerging from fog to replace the last. He began to see them as a symbol of something deeper than mere industrial capacity, something that struck at the foundation of everything the Reich represented. The Third Reich was built on theories of hierarchy and natural superiority, on the belief that discipline and will and racial purity could overcome material disadvantages. But what did those theories mean when confronted with an enemy who could manufacture vehicles faster than they could be destroyed, who could lose 1,000 trucks and barely notice the loss, who approached warfare not as a test of spirit but as a problem of industrial production? In August, Weber became a prisoner. His unit was surrounded near Falaise, cut off by the same American mobility that he had been watching with growing dread all summer. They fought for 3 days and then surrendered, out of ammunition, out of food, out of options. The Americans who took him prisoner arrived in jeeps, naturally. Young men who looked impossibly clean and well-fed, who seemed almost apologetic about the whole business, who offered him water from canteens and a ride in one of those ubiquitous vehicles to the rear areas where he would begin his journey into captivity. He sat in the back of a jeep, hands unbound because the Americans seemed remarkably unconcerned about a middle-aged officer posing any threat, and watched the French countryside roll past. The road was clogged with American traffic, trucks carrying troops and supplies, jeeps darting between larger vehicles, tank transporters hauling Shermans toward the front. Everything moved with organized chaos, directed by military police at intersections, flowing like a river that had been temporarily channeled but could not be stopped. He tried to estimate the value of what he was seeing, the resources represented by this single road at this single moment, and the numbers became absurd. This was one road. The Americans were operating on dozens of roads. This was one day. They had been doing this for months, and would continue for months more. The prisoner of war camp was in eastern France, a sprawling complex of tents and barbed wire that held thousands of German soldiers. Weber was housed with other officers in a separate compound, granted the privileges of rank even in defeat. The camp itself was a lesson in American abundance. The fences were sturdy, the guard towers well built, the administration buildings solid and weatherproof. Everything had an air of temporary permanence, of being constructed well enough to last but with the understanding that it would eventually be dismantled and the materials used elsewhere. This was not a camp built to endure for generations, but it was built competently, with evident resources, by an army that could afford to devote energy and material to housing prisoners while simultaneously fighting a war on multiple continents. But it was the vehicles that continued to define his captivity. The camp was supplied by truck convoys that arrived with clockwork regularity: food, medicine, fuel for generators, construction materials, mail, everything the Americans seemed to need to maintain a small city of captive soldiers. Weber watched these convoys with the professional attention of a logistics officer, noting arrival times, counting vehicles, estimating cargo capacities. He kept a journal, writing down his observations in small, precise handwriting, as if by documenting this abundance he could somehow understand it. Other officers joined his observations. They gathered in small groups. These men who had once planned operations and commanded units, now reduced to spectators of their own defeat. They compared notes from different fronts, different campaigns. An officer who had fought in North Africa spoke of American supply dumps that stretched for miles, of finding abandoned vehicles with nothing wrong except a flat tire or empty fuel tank. A panzer commander described watching American tank crews discard damaged engines rather than repair them, simply lifting out the old motor with a crane and dropping in a new one, the whole operation taking hours instead of days. An artillery officer told of American batteries that seemed to have unlimited ammunition, that could fire preparation barrages that lasted for hours, that expended in a single day what a German battery might be allocated for a month. "They don't fight like we fight," someone said one evening, as they sat in their tent watching another supply convoy rumble past the camp gates. "They don't fight with soldiers, they fight with factories." It was not the defeat that broke them, but the understanding of what the defeat represented. They could have borne loss in battle, could have maintained pride in having been overcome by a superior foe, but this was not a story of martial valor. This was a story of assembly lines and production quotas, of an industrial base so vast that it could treat military vehicles like disposable commodities. They had been taught that war was about courage and skill and the strength of national character, but here was evidence that war, modern war, was about the capacity to manufacture jeeps and trucks in quantities that defied imagination, to ship them across oceans, to deploy them with such casual abundance that they became wallpaper, background noise, unremarkable. Weber spoke with American officers sometimes, formal conversations marked by careful courtesy on both sides. He asked once about the jeeps, trying to sound casual, professionally curious. The American, a major from somewhere called Michigan, looked puzzled by the question. "The jeeps? What about them?" "How many do you have?" Weber asked. The major shrugged. "I don't know. Tens of thousands? Hundreds of thousands? They make about 1,000 a day, I think. Maybe more now. I don't really keep track." 1,000 a day. The number sat in Weber's mind like a stone. His entire division had not had 1,000 vehicles of all types combined. The Americans were producing 1,000 jeeps, just jeeps, every single day. And they had been doing this for years. And jeeps were only a fraction of their output, a small part of a manufacturing machine that was also building bombers and tanks and trucks and ships and weapons and ammunition and everything else an army needed. "How?" Weber asked, unable to help himself. "How is this possible?" The major looked at him with something like sympathy. "We're a big country," he said. "A lot of people, a lot of factories. We make a lot of stuff in peacetime too. Cars, refrigerators, radios. We just turned the whole thing toward making military equipment instead. Honestly, it's keeping everyone employed. The war's been good for the economy." The war was good for the economy. Weber turned this phrase over in his mind for days afterward. In Germany, the war had consumed everything, had demanded total sacrifice, had stripped the country to the bone in pursuit of victory. In America, apparently, the war was a jobs program, an engine of prosperity, something that kept factories humming and workers employed. They were not sacrificing to build these vehicles. They were profiting from it. Winter came, and the camp settled into the rhythms of captivity. Men wrote letters home that might or might not arrive. They organized classes, teaching each other languages and skills. They followed news of the war with the painful attention of those who no longer had any power to affect its outcome. They watched the roads, and the convoys continued, endless and inevitable as weather. Weber taught a seminar on military logistics to younger officers who might somehow return to service. He found himself describing pre-war German theories, the careful calculations of supply and demand, the strategic emphasis on capturing enemy resources. His lectures felt hollow even as he delivered them. All of this theory, this carefully developed doctrine, had assumed a world where resources were scarce, where armies fought with roughly comparable material means, where victory went to those who used their limited assets most efficiently. But what happened when one side's resources were not limited? What happened when efficiency became irrelevant because abundance made waste affordable? "We were fighting the last war," he told his students one gray January afternoon. "We had learned lessons from 1918 about supply lines and resource allocation. We had studied Napoleon's campaigns and Clausewitz's theories. We thought we understood logistics, but the Americans were not fighting the same kind of war. They had moved beyond the constraints that we thought were universal laws of warfare." One of the younger officers, a lieutenant who had been captured at the Bulge, raised his hand. "But sir, if they had such superiority, such abundance, why did it take them so long? Why did we fight for years against this?" It was a good question, the kind that deserved a thoughtful answer. Weber considered his words carefully. Because vehicles are not everything. They had to learn to use them, had to develop doctrine, had to transport them across oceans. And because we fought well, with skill and determination, but look where we are. Look at what happened. In the end, they ground us down not through superior tactics but through superior supply. They could afford to learn because they could afford to lose. Every tank we destroyed was replaced. Every truck we captured or disabled was written off and forgotten because there were always more. We bled them, but they had so much blood that it made no difference. The jeeps and trucks continued to haunt the landscape of his captivity. He saw them everywhere, performing every function, ubiquitous as air. They carried guards around the perimeter. They delivered mail. They transported prisoners to work details. They hauled garbage. They served as mobile generators, as communications platforms, as general-purpose tools that could be adapted to any need. The Americans treated them with casual disregard, drove them hard, performed minimal maintenance, used them until they broke, and then simply replaced them. It was not the technology that impressed Weber, though the vehicles were well-designed and reliable. It was the philosophy they represented, the fundamentally different worldview they embodied. German engineering emphasized precision and craftsmanship, building things to last, maintaining them carefully. These jeeps were built to be adequate, to be functional, to be produced in vast quantities. They were not beautiful or exceptional. They were good enough, repeated infinitely. He thought often about the factories that built these machines. He imagined assembly lines, workers fitting parts together with practiced efficiency, vehicles rolling off production lines in an endless stream. He imagined the steel mills that provided the raw material, the rubber plantations that supplied the tires, the oil refineries that produced the fuel. He tried to visualize the entire industrial ecosystem that supported this abundance, and his imagination failed. The scale was too large, the system too complex, the resources too vast. In March, a new group of prisoners arrived, soldiers captured in the final defense of the Rhineland. They brought stories of German cities flattened by American bombers, of the homeland being crushed under the weight of Allied assault. They also brought stories of the roads, now inside Germany itself, clogged with American vehicles pushing eastward in columns that stretched for miles. The Americans were in Germany now, bringing their jeeps and trucks in abundance to the heart of the Reich, and nothing was stopping them. Weber felt something break inside him, some final thread of hope or illusion. This was how it ended. Not in glorious battle but in overwhelming material superiority, buried under an avalanche of mass-produced vehicles. The 1,000-year Reich was collapsing under the wheels of jeeps manufactured in distant American factories by workers who probably could not find Germany on a map. He wrote letters to his wife that spring, careful letters that avoided discussing conditions or opinions, that focused on small human details, that tried to maintain some connection to the life he had known. He told her about the weather, about fellow officers, about books he was reading. He did not tell her about the jeeps, about the endless convoys, about the slow realization that everything they had believed about their nation's strength and destiny had been founded on lies and miscalculation. How could he explain that they had lost the war not because they lacked courage or skill or determination, But because they lacked factories, assembly lines, the raw industrial capacity to manufacture enough Jeeps, April brought news of the final collapse. Berlin surrounded, Hitler dead, the regime in its death throes. In the camp, men reacted with shock or relief or numbness. Some wept. Others sat in silence. Weber felt mainly a profound weariness, a bone-deep exhaustion that had nothing to do with physical labor. He was tired of being wrong, tired of having his understanding of the world contradicted by reality, tired of vehicles rumbling past. In May, the war ended. Germany surrendered unconditionally, and in the camp, the news was met with quiet acknowledgement. There was no celebration among the prisoners, but neither was there despair. They had already absorbed their defeat, had been living with it for months or years. The formal end changed nothing, except perhaps opening the possibility of eventual return home, to whatever home might mean in a shattered Germany. Weber stood at the fence that evening, watching the road as he had watched it countless times before. The convoys continued. The jeeps and trucks rolled past, indifferent to the end of the war in Europe, already being redirected to other theaters, other purposes. The machinery of American logistics had not paused for victory. It simply continued, implacable and unstoppable, a force of nature that happened to be manufactured in Detroit and Akron and Pittsburgh. An American guard stood nearby, young and relaxed, his war now safely over. Weber nodded to him, and the guard nodded back. "It must feel strange," the guard said, "the war being over." "Yes," Weber agreed, "strange." He paused, then asked a question that had been forming in his mind for months. The vehicles, the jeeps and trucks, when the war is over, what happens to them? The guard shrugged. "I don't know. Sell them, I guess. Drive them home. Some will go to Europe, help rebuild. A lot will probably just get scrapped. We made so many, we don't really need them all." Scrapped. Millions of vehicles, each one representing resources and labor and industrial capacity, simply scrapped because they were surplus to requirements. Weber nodded slowly. "Of course," he said. The guard looked at him curiously. "Were you wondering about getting one? I bet you could buy a surplus Jeep pretty cheap after the war." Weber almost laughed, stopped himself. "Perhaps," he said. That night, he sat in his tent and tried to write a final entry in his journal, something that would capture what he had learned, what he had witnessed. The words came slowly. He wrote about the jeeps and trucks, about the convoys that had defined his captivity. He wrote about the collapse of his understanding, the way reality had systematically dismantled every assumption he had held about warfare and national strength and the organization of industrial societies. He wrote about the future, about a world that would be shaped by nations that could manufacture abundance, that could approach problems not through efficiency and scarcity but through overwhelming productive capacity. "We believed," he wrote, "that will and discipline could overcome material disadvantages. We believed that our cause and our character made us superior to nations weakened by democracy and diversity. But we learned that in modern war, factories matter more than faith, that production lines are more powerful than propaganda. The Americans did not defeat us because they were better soldiers. They defeated us because they could build 1,000 jeeps a day and we could not. This is the lesson of our defeat, hard and humbling. The future belongs not to those who fight most bravely, but to those who can manufacture most abundantly." He put down his pen and sat in silence, listening to the sounds of the camp settling for the night. And beyond that, faint but constant, the rumble of vehicles on the road, heading somewhere, carrying something, part of a system so vast that his defeat was barely a footnote in its operations. The repatriation came slowly, processing thousands of prisoners over months. Weber returned to Germany in the autumn of 1945, to a country that barely resembled the one he had left. The cities were ruins, the economy destroyed, the population traumatized and desperate. American jeeps and trucks were everywhere here too, now driven by occupation forces, delivering aid, patrolling streets, serving as visible symbols of who had won and who had lost. He found work eventually, helping to organize relief efforts, using his logistics experience to distribute supplies in the shattered remnants of a city he no longer recognized. The supplies came in American trucks. The administration was overseen by American officers who arrived in jeeps. Everything was stamped with the same casual abundance he had witnessed in France. The same overwhelming capacity to simply provide, to solve problems by applying resources until the problems disappeared. Years later, long after he had rebuilt some semblance of life, after Germany had begun its own recovery and transformation, Weber would sometimes see a jeep on the street, preserved by a collector or imported as surplus. Each time, he would stop and look at it, this small green vehicle that had once represented the collapse of everything he believed. He would remember the convoys, the endless stream of vehicles that had rolled past his captivity, and he would feel again the strange vertigo of having his worldview overturned by something as mundane as industrial production. It was not the jeeps themselves that had mattered, he came to understand. It was what they revealed about the world, about the new reality that had emerged from the war. The future would belong to nations that could harness industrial capacity on unprecedented scales, that could manufacture abundance, that could approach challenges with overwhelming resources rather than careful efficiency. The jeeps were not just vehicles. They were harbingers of a new age, rolling symbols of a transformed world order built on assembly lines and mass production, and the power of economies that could treat war material as disposable commodities. The young saw the American vehicles as symbols of liberation or occupation, depending on their perspective. But men of Weber's generation, men who had witnessed the transition, understood them differently. They saw in those ubiquitous jeeps and trucks the instrument of their education, the tool that had taught them how thoroughly they had misunderstood the nature of modern power. They had been defeated not by better generals or braver soldiers, but by factories they had dismissed as impossible, by an industrial capacity they had refused to credit until it buried them under an avalanche of olive green steel. This was the truth that the jeeps had delivered, rumbling down roads in convoys without end, present at every moment from first encounter to final defeat and beyond, into occupation and reconstruction. They were there at the beginning of understanding and at the end of illusions, small and unremarkable and infinite in number, each one a rolling refutation of the theories and beliefs that had led a generation into catastrophe. The Nazi officers had been baffled by them because accepting the reality they represented meant accepting that everything they had been taught about strength and superiority and national destiny was wrong, that they had fought their war based on calculations that bore no relation to the actual balance of power, that they had never had a chance because they had never understood what they were fighting against. And there were thousands more stories like this, waiting to be remembered.